Good morning, everyone. The subcommittee will now come to order, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I'm pleased to welcome our sole witness today, the Inspector General of the Environmental Protection Agency, Sean O'Donnell. Mr. O'Donnell has held the position of Inspector General since early 2020 and is here to testify before this subcommittee on the spending and activities of the agency, especially those connected to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, and the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. For context, the Environmental Protection Agency's entire non-IIJA, non-IRA annual budget for fiscal year 2024 is $10.136 billion. This amount reflects an increase of 10.4% over EPA's fiscal year 2021 funding level of $9.085 billion. The IIJA alone provided EPA $60 billion over 5 fiscal years, or $12 million in annual appropriations to EPA. Not only was it the single largest appropriation ever provided to EPA, but it also more than doubled annual spending at the agency during the Biden-Harris administration. The IRA later came along and gave EPA another $41.5 billion in new and expanded programs at EPA. That's 2 bills, an additional $101.5 billion, and roughly 10 times the amount of money normally dropped off at EPA to spend. This is a massive infusion of funding and outrageous level of spending and pressure on our national debt, particularly from many of my Republican colleagues who represent almost 2/3 of congressional districts in America, where the average median income is below the national average and whose children will be asked to pay for this spending. Regardless of if you voted for these bills, though, I hope you will agree with me that it is imperative that Congress conducts robust oversight of all this money given to EPA and the other agencies. It is the right thing to do. That said, I realize that there may be some limits on how much information the Inspector General has for us today and may be able to get for us in the future. Congress clearly directed his office to oversee IIJA funding and gave his office $53 million a year to do it. Unfortunately, IRA provided the IG no requirements to police that spending, and Congress has approved no funding to do it. Regardless, fulfilling these directives, or lack thereof, are dependent upon the willingness of EPA to allow real oversight to occur. The committee has had uneven results in its own investigating of these programs. Sometimes we have had success, sometimes we have met resistance, and usually we've been made to wait a long time to find out which it is. When Administrator Regan testified earlier this year, he assured us that he talks with the IG all the time when we asked him if he was fully cooperating on the oversight. I look forward to finding out if the Inspector General's experience has been different than the committee's. If his experience is less than satisfactory, I would like to know what legal constraints he faces and what he needs from EPA to be successful. I also think it is important to find out if EPA implemented any lessons that it should have learned from its spending experiences with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And if EPA made any changes based on this experience, what difference, if any, they made. We should know more about how much of the allocated IRA funding has already been spent, what type of quality control EPA and its grantees are placing on the disbursement and use of this funding, including by third-party vendors on the use of the money, and what objective measures are being used to measure the results. Finally, I hope we are able to explore some of EPA's interactions with the states, which also have a significant burden with these funds. This is especially important in the light of the aggressive regulatory push by this administration and its non-governmental ideological allies. I look forward to an insightful discussion with our witness, and I yield back the rest of my time. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, my friend, Representative Tonko, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Inspector General O'Donnell, welcome back to the committee. I value the important role that Inspectors General play in conducting oversight and protecting against waste, fraud, and abuse. Mr. O'Donnell, I want to assure you that I support providing your office with the resources necessary for you to carry out your duties. I understand, based on your testimony, that you have some concerns about EPA's ability to manage the historic funding it has been provided under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. The reality is that whether it is in the public sector, the private sector, or even in our personal lives, doing anything new and ambitious can indeed be challenging. But we should be working to rise to meet those challenges. And in this instance, the Congress can continue to provide support to EPA to ensure its success. Because yes, the investments being made under the IIJA and the IRA are historically large. But that is because the congressional supporters of those laws felt the scale of our nation's infrastructure, environmental, and public health challenges required an historically large response. Make no mistake, these investments are massively improving the lives of Americans. This includes more than $35 billion to repair our drinking water infrastructure and replace dangerous lead pipes, $5 billion to remediate brownfields and Superfund sites, $5 billion to deploy clean school buses, and billions more for clean energy and pollution-reducing investments with a focus on underserved communities. Undoubtedly, these investments will improve public health and create tremendous economic development opportunities. I would be the first to admit that these programs deserve appropriate oversight. No one wants money to be spent ineffectively when it can be doing such good for the American people. But proper oversight should not equate to hoping or actively seeking to undermine these federal programs. And that is why I take issue with the majority's hearing title, which claims that today is about holding EPA accountable for green spending. I would remind my colleagues that the EPA is merely following the laws that were written, proudly I might add, in large part by Democrats on this committee, and supported by a majority of members in both chambers of Congress. Frankly, we would need to hold EPA accountable if they were failing to follow the law by not spending this money. My colleagues across the aisle have not been shy about their dislike for these infrastructure remediation and pollution reduction investments, and they are well within their rights to continue their crusade to repeal major sections of these laws, as they have tried and failed to do on numerous occasions over the past 2 years, regardless of how many benefits will be provided to the American people. I know we have got into the habit of inviting Inspector General O'Donnell to the committee and asking, often prematurely, about all of the potential problems, both real and imagined, that could occur with the administration of these funds. But I would encourage my colleagues across the aisle to take up their ideological issues about the IIJA and the IRA with us, House Democrats. And I would certainly welcome everyone across the aisle telling the American people that congressional Democrats are to blame for getting the lead pipes out of their drinking water, for getting their kids off of polluting school buses, and for finally cleaning up those brownfields that have been eyesores in their neighborhoods for years. So, Mr. Inspector General, I thank you again for being here. And I do want to reiterate that I want these programs to be successful. I want them to be administered effectively. Any dollar being wasted is a dollar not helping the American people, as intended by the supporters of these laws. But I also want us to have a fair-minded conversation about the legitimate administrative challenges that EPA may be dealing with. And with that, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. American families are struggling to make ends meet. The Biden-Harris administration's radical rush to green energy policies have fueled out-of-control inflation, which has driven up prices by more than 20% and destroyed the economic stability American families deserve. While American families are increasingly worried about unaffordable cost, the Biden-Harris administration is working relentlessly to expand its radical energy agenda. Today, we'll examine the EPA, the most radical EPA to date, and its rush to green spending spree, as well as how we can hold them accountable for the American people. In November of 2021, the Biden-Harris administration signed into law the so-called Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, authorizing $1.2 trillion in spending. $60 billion of taxpayer dollars was provided to the EPA, the single largest grant of funding ever at one time to an agency, doubling their overall budget for 5 straight years. Not even 1 year later, in August of 2022, the administration provided another $41.5 billion to the EPA in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. As Republicans warned, the Inflation Reduction Act did not lower inflation. It made already surging inflation worse. Recently, President Biden admitted that the goal of the bill was to fund his radical rush to green agenda, calling it the most significant climate change law ever. Spending at this pace and scale for any agency should raise concerns, but especially for an agency like EPA, with their known track record of waste, fraud, and abuse. 15 years ago, the Obama administration doled out $787 billion in taxpayer money to pay for a slew of programs and pet projects. The EPA was awarded at that time $7.2 billion, nearly doubling its budget at the time. Even at that level, the EPA was not able to responsibly manage the spending. The Inspector General at the time found funding that violated various federal requirements, poor guidance from the agency to states and recipients of the money, and problems with managing, monitoring, verifying where the money was being spent. And that is why it is incredibly alarming that since President Biden took office, the EPA has been given $109 billion in additional funding and grown its workforce to over 15,000 employees. The amount of funding and scope of these laws demand consistent and rigorous oversight by Congress and independent bodies like the Inspector General, especially considering failures of the past. Anything less is a disservice to taxpayers. EPA cannot continue to fund the most radical parts of a rush to green agenda, one that puts America on a dangerous path, threatens our economic and national security, and enriches our adversaries like China. Take, for example, the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is just a $27 billion slush fund of taxpayer money that is vulnerable to waste, fraud, and abuse. At an oversight subcommittee hearing we held earlier this year, the EPA could not confirm whether or not the Chinese Communist Party could receive money from this fund. Additionally, EPA has issued stringent and burdensome regulations on coal and natural gas-fired power plants, while also dragging their feet in processing carbon capture permits, which are needed to comply with these power plant regulations. EPA is imposing harsh government mandates and making it even harder for plants to adjust to the new rules. There's countless examples of EPA's radical rush to green spending and regulatory policies like these. It's troubling that the Inflation Reduction Act did not provide the Office of Inspector General, the office that ensures accountability and integrity at EPA, funding. No funding to conduct necessary oversight. In addition to greater accountability and transparency, the EPA also must return to its core statutory functions, which do not include undermining the economic prosperity of the United States or driving up costs across the board for Americans. Sunshine is the best disinfectant, and I look forward to shining the light on what's happening at the EPA during today's hearing. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair I will now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, my friend from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Democrats delivered historic wins for the American people last Congress by passing both the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And these laws are creating hundreds of thousands of new good-paying jobs, cutting costs for working families, and strengthening America's energy independence by expanding homegrown clean energy. But that is not the story the Republicans will attempt to tell at today's hearing. Unfortunately, this hearing is another transparently political attempt to undermine the EPA and denounce so-called rush to green policies, excuse me, under the guise of oversight. And time and again, Republicans have made clear that they're not interested in effective implementation of EPA programs or constructive oversight. Instead, they're fixated on undermining these laws as directed by Trump's Extreme Project 2025. Trump's Project 2025 is a manifesto that lays out a plan for consolidating power in the White House, gutting checks and balances, and eliminating the independence of our federal agencies like EPA. It specifically calls for repealing the Inflation Reduction Act, completely eliminating vital EPA offices, rescinding longstanding authorities that allow EPA to fulfill its mission, and undermining science by wholly dismantling the agency's independent scientific advisory boards. All in all, Trump's Project 2025 would politicize EPA and completely starve the agency of resources, making it nearly impossible for the agency to fulfill its mission of protecting public health and the environment. And my Republican colleagues have spent this entire Congress trying to implement Trump's Project 2025 plans. For example, H.R. 1, the Polluter Over Peoples Act, undercuts EPA's authority and aimed to fully repeal key EPA programs like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So my Republican colleagues can't in good faith now claim that they want programs like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to succeed when they've tried to repeal it 3 times before it was even fully implemented. They're also unfairly targeting programs like the Clean School Bus Program, which, by the way, has been so popular that demand for this funding has consistently outpaced supply in every round of funding. Schools, parents, and students across the country want cleaner, healthier air, and EPA is delivering. Deployment challenges always arise with new programs, and EPA's Office of the Inspector General identified opportunities for improvements. The good news is EPA has already implemented or is in the process of addressing those recommendations. So it should be no surprise that the majority's recent staff report on the Clean School Bus Program failed to expose any waste, fraud, or abuse, contrary to their hyperbolic press release. So while I appreciate the opportunity to hear from the Inspector General about his office's work, I believe the Republican majority is holding this hearing essentially in bad faith. Committee Republicans claim to care about oversight, but they make it clear that their true intention is to smear and tear down programs that do not fit in with their polluters over people agenda. And we can't confuse fear-mongering with good faith constructive oversight. So EPA takes its obligation in administering its programs very seriously, especially as the first line of defense against waste, fraud, and abuse. And I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that there are hardworking people at EPA ensuring every dollar is spent fulfilling the agency's mission to protect human health and the environment. And throughout the Biden-Harris administration, EPA has consistently demonstrated a strong commitment to working with the OIG to improve programs and address concerns. As Inspector General O'Donnell notes, EPA Administrator Reagan is, and I quote, setting the tone at the top regarding cooperation between the agency and the OIG. Democrats remain committed to conducting constructive oversight that will help programs succeed and complement the IG's important oversight work. In fact, we provided nearly $270 million for the EPA's OIG in the bipartisan infrastructure law. What's more, the Biden-Harris administration has requested increases in funding to support the EPA OIG's work. Additionally, that additional funding the Republicans have roundly rejected, by the way. So I believe constructive congressional oversight can enhance EPA's efforts to mitigate program risk and make certain that every dollar has the greatest possible impact. Unfortunately, I haven't witnessed much constructive oversight from my Republican colleagues. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. We now conclude with member opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. Ladies and gentlemen, our witness for today is the Honorable Sean W. O'Donnell, Inspector General of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Welcome, Mr. O'Donnell. Inspector General O'Donnell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Rogers, Chairman Carter, ranking members Pallone and Tonko, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Sean O'Donnell, the Inspector General of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I would like to thank the committee for inviting me to testify about my office's oversight relating to the more than $100 billion that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act appropriated to the EPA. Oversight is vital to ensuring the EPA and its grantees and contractors are responsible stewards of American tax dollars. With the resources Congress provided us for IIJA oversight, we have focused on fraud prevention, the strengthening of internal controls, and focused on the operations of IIJA programs. Thus far, we have identified at least 2 systemic issues, namely the use of data in managing grants and the operation of fraud prevention internal controls. The EPA must leverage relevant, timely data to ensure effective program operations, particularly as it manages an unprecedented level of funding under the IIJA and the IRA. However, the agency faces significant challenges that limit the usefulness of its data. The EPA's use of disparate systems and incompatible data formats causes significant delays in gathering information, results in redundant reporting, and hampers the ability to track programs. As an example, the EPA's initial reporting of its fiscal year 2022 spending in usaspending.gov was incomplete and inaccurate, leading to the underreporting of billions of dollars of obligations and outlays. This was caused in part from a lack of procedures to detect errors and ensure the reporting of complete and accurate data. At the same time, the EPA needs to ensure that internal controls related to fraud prevention and detection are implemented and working appropriately. One of the most important, and it's hardly surprising that an Inspector General thinks this, is audit. The EPA, however, has been inconsistent and incorrect regarding the guidance that it gives to recipients and subrecipients on the use of audits related to IIJA programs. For example, we recently discovered that the EPA incorrectly told states that they do not have to review single audits of non-federal entities that borrow money from state revolving funds. This contradicted statutory and regulatory requirements, creating risk that the states may not be using single audit reports to evaluate the risk for or detect fraud, waste, or abuse. This is particularly concerning because in 2022, the EPA finalized a rule that relieved the SRFs from regulatorily required subrecipient monitoring requirements. Another important internal control is the reporting of suspected fraud, waste, and abuse. I'm pleased that Administrator Regan has set a positive tone from the top, including annual reminders to EPA staff to cooperate with the OIG in our shared fight against fraud, waste, and abuse. Despite this, we have seen a disturbing trend of failure to do just that. For example, the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division has repeatedly withheld allegations of fraud that is received or placed conditions on its disclosure to the OIG. The EPA has continued to resist the OIG's important oversight role in protecting scientific integrity at the EPA. Just this week, we issued a series of reports on alleged retaliation for expressing differing scientific opinions. These reports underscore the indispensable role of the OIG in protecting scientific integrity. Yet, the EPA will not revise coordination procedures between the OIG and its scientific integrity program to require, among other things, the prompt reporting of political interference or related misconduct by senior agency officials to the OIG. The issues I've outlined so far are critical areas of concern in EPA programs, as they play a pivotal role in ensuring the agency's ability to track program performance and mitigate the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse. My written testimony illustrates how these affect three major IIJA programs: the state revolving funds, the Queen School Bus, and Superfund. My office has shown that when properly funded, we provide some of the most effective oversight in the federal government. Unfortunately, our oversight more broadly, and specifically with respect to the IRA, faces significant challenge. I have warned in the past that the pace of IRA spending, when conducted by new programs and received by new recipients, significantly increases fraud vulnerabilities. Given what we have seen in the EPA's IIJA spending, I have no reason to believe that the IRA spending will be immune to the challenges we see in IIJA spending. Despite this, the IRA fails to provide any funds for our oversight. This, along with over a decade of flat or declining OIG budgets, leaves our office without sufficient capacity to effectively oversee the EPA's spending of more than $40 billion in taxpayer money. Again, I thank the committee for inviting me to speak with you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
The gentleman yields. We will now begin questioning, and I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. O'Donnell, Administrator Reagan testified here this past May on the EPA's fiscal year 2025 proposed budget. When asked about EPA's transparency and willingness to have oversight conducted, he said, "Y'all talk all the time." Yet your written testimony says EPA has continued to resist the OIG's oversight role in certain areas that ultimately led to poor management outcomes. I take it that you have good relations with senior EPA leadership, but that's not really the issue with EPA managing spending, is it?
No.
So is EPA providing the guidance and collecting the information it needs to adequately ensure grants and funding are used effectively?
We have issued a series of reports, and and I, on the side, make it a point to meet with stakeholders, states, industry, and the like regarding EPA guidance on IIJ spending. And I think there's a felt need across the board for better guidance, whether it's BABA or American Iron and Steel or any of these types of requirements.
So what does this say about the agency's ability to safeguard taxpayer spending?
I think the concerns that we raised repeatedly, if I were to summarize it, I do believe that the men and women at the EPA are sincere in their beliefs that they are achieving good outcomes. Our concern is the follow through and ensuring that the dollars actually are spent appropriately.
Now, let me go ahead and get this out here. You keep on saying the IIJA. Are you doing any oversight at all on the IRA? I mean, I know there were no funds appropriated to you, and you got to be careful about what you're using the funds for, but are you doing anything on the IRA?
So I'd like to say first, and I know Representative Tonko mentioned it as well, we're fortunate. The EPA sees the value of effective oversight and has supported both our budget and reprogramming. They support it here before the committee. They support it publicly. They tell me this. But truth be told, unfortunately, there are two houses in Congress, and this one has supported us, and that's where it's ended. I can say that we will do reactive work with respect to IRA, so criminal investigations, and we have some preliminary criminal investigations ongoing. And then we have some small amount of IRA when it's connected to other things, but truth be told, with a budget that was cut this last year, it's hard just to keep up with the core functions of the EPA.
Disappointed to hear that. You mentioned in your testimony that states don't have the capacity to manage funds. I'm curious what this indicates about non-governmental recipients. In the IRA, EPA was given just 2 years and $27 billion to create and fund a new type of green finance industry. Yet Congress appropriated only $30 million to develop and oversee the program. I also understand that most of the EPA's selectees for this green bank funding seem to have virtually no experience with these kind of awards. For instance, Coalition for Green Capital, or CGC, received a $5 billion award, yet the organization has never issued a grant and never made a loan. They've never run or even started a green bank. CGC's entire budget for 2022 was less than $2 million, according to their tax filing. CGC hardly seems prepared for this kind of spending, and other recipients seem similarly inexperienced. Does this mismatch between organizational capacity, the size of the grants awarded under the program, and the very limited oversight funding raise potential concerns?
I think, yes, that we have concerns, and I know that the EPA has concerns. For us, if I can analogize again, we speak to the capacity of the state revolving funds who have been in existence and doing this thing for some time, and they themselves tell us, or in the course of our oversight work, we see financial, operational, professional capacity. So I would assume if you're new to the game, you're going to have capacity issues.
We just can't simply ignore the fact that they are going to be getting a $5 billion award, and yet last year they only spent $2 million?
So the EPA has been proactive in meeting with us to discuss the programs, and most recently they discussed their use of a private bank as pay agent for these programs. I have to tell you that I prosecuted financial crimes involving banks, and I found it fantastically complex. So I can only imagine what it's going to be like for the EPA to.
Okay, well, I certainly hope you're going to pay close attention to this, and I know you will. I've run out of time. I now recognize Ranking Member Tonko for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Scientific integrity is an integral part of the robust science-based decision-making we expect from agencies like EPA. Unfortunately, there have been instances of bad actors disregarding scientific integrity. Inspector General O'Donnell, I know you are familiar with an instance when Trump administration appointees at EPA interfered to weaken the toxicity assessment of a dangerous chemical, PFBS. Mr. O'Donnell, that assessment was pulled, amended, and later republished. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
I think that is an important point and a good example of EPA's scientific integrity policy and a policy that's working well. Career scientists felt political appointees had changed the report's scientific findings. A complaint was made through the agency's process, and the report was taken offline, reviewed, amended, and finally republished within a 3-week period. Of course, ideally, that initial violation would not have happened, but I commend EPA for taking quick action to remedy the interference. It highlights the importance of having strong scientific integrity culture and procedures within any agency. Preserving EPA employees' options to seek advice and file complaints through numerous different channels, including the OIG, the GAO, and the agency's scientific integrity official, and even Congress, is critically important to ensuring that these issues can be raised in a manner that employees feel most comfortable and protected. Yesterday, your office issued 5 reports regarding whistleblower complaints it received from EPA staff. I appreciate you investigating these allegations. When the complaints were first reported, I, along with ranking members Pallone and DeGette, sent a letter to the agency expressing our concerns. According to these reports, the whistleblowers alleged retaliation by EPA for raising differing scientific views, violating EPA's scientific integrity policy. While the reports did not substantiate all of the allegations, the OIG did substantiate allegations from 3 of the 5 whistleblowers. So, Mr. O'Donnell, unfortunately, these reports are heavily redacted, and the timing of events and whether allegations were substantiated is not entirely clear. So it appears that all of the substantiated allegations are related to incidents that occurred under the last administration. Is that correct?
The retaliatory acts with respect to those 3 individuals occurred, I think, in 2020, yes.
Okay, and I also understand that you did not substantiate allegations of retaliation by EPA under the current administration. Is that correct?
We did not substantiate any allegations of direct retaliation after 2020.
Thank you. And Inspector General O'Donnell, I respect the work of your office and your statutory role to promote proper management of the agency. I also think it's important to acknowledge the many steps EPA's current leadership has taken to restore scientific integrity over the past 4 years. Specifically in the Office of Chemical Safety, this includes prioritizing more resources, securing more personnel, and creating a science policy advisor position. I will not suggest that every issue has been fully solved, but it is clear that this administration is indeed committed to making improvements in safeguarding scientific integrity. It is a stark contrast to the several instances of political interference that have been reported earlier under a different administration, specifically the Trump administration. So I thank you for your responses, and with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank the witness for being here. Mr. O'Donnell, you made a comment about EPA's criminal division. Will you be a little more specific about the issues there?
There has long been a hostility by the Criminal Investigation Division against the work of the Office of Inspector General in its criminal and civil fraud investigations. Just as a sort of point of reference, our antiquity is of greater length than theirs. We have, since 1978, been leaders in fighting fraud at the EPA. Unfortunately, and this sometimes plays into a law enforcement trope, we have jurisdictional issues that might be raised, whether they're real or not. My philosophy since the day I got here, and I had been a prosecutor before coming here, is disagreements between law enforcement agencies is silly and it doesn't get us to where we need to go. But unfortunately for us, we see interference in our criminal and civil investigation, almost every aspect of our work, whether it's the facilities that we have, interference with our personnel, or interference with our law enforcement operations.
My concern about the EPA's criminal division is that they're as heavily armed as some military units. I mean, they have amphibious vehicles, they have drones, they have weapons, some heavy weapons, night vision. I mean, I asked former Administrator Gina McCarthy why they had that, and she said to defend the environment. And I asked, well, to defend it against whom? I don't know anybody, I don't see any reason why they would need anti-tank weapons. Have you asked them to provide an inventory of the weapons and military-style equipment that they have at the criminal division? I'd like to see that if they still have all that.
I have not, but I believe Senator Grassley did and got a response on that. I don't recall what the answer was. I would say, if you want to look at the difference between, say, us and Criminal Investigative Division, we're part of a larger IG community. So we are subjected to peer reviews every 3 years. We investigate according to standards. Our UC operations are reviewed by a committee of SIGI. None of these things exist for the.
It concerns me, though, that there's that much resistance from a federal agency to the oversight responsibilities of the Inspector General. And I really respect the fact that you continue to assert your right to exercise oversight over all of the EPA. In that regard, the EPA went into the banking business. They set up a $27 billion Green New Deal bank, and there's some real issues with that because of the timelines involved. And this is where you really start to waste money. And I'm just wondering, there's $14 billion that is, some of it's being allocated to 3 nonprofits. And I know we saw this with gain of function research with NIH, that they didn't make those type grants directly, but the grantee did sub-grants. Are you able to exercise oversight over sub-grants?
We would be able to do that, yes.
That's encouraging. They also are allocating $6 billion to 5 institutions to create hubs for funding. And the timelines that are required here are disturbing to me, that they're pushing an agenda and not pursuing science. They're not pursuing clear engineering strategies for addressing the issues that the EPA is supposed to be addressing. And I think it's more about a political agenda than anything else. So I'm not going to ask you to comment on that in particular, but they're pushing programs like the EPA Clean Bus Program, and even in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. I call it the Income Reduction Act. And I do take exception to people alleging that we have a Polluters Over People Act as though there's legislation. That's a lie. That's a Marxist strategy. But we hear it all the time on this committee, so we've kind of gotten used to it. But you had an opportunity to speak about the EPA's Clean Bus Program, and the American public's been exposed to the issues plaguing this program. So in your semi-annual report, you noted that because EPA does not have a robust verification mechanisms within that program for the rebates and grant application process, it led to issues like applicants not being transparent and third parties submitting applications on behalf of unwitting school districts, in other words, committing fraud. How many of these instances did your office identify?
Well, obviously there were the instances in the evaluation. I believe we had a management implication report that identified an administrative school district that had no students yet received money for a clean school bus. And we have a forthcoming audit that I think will illuminate on this more.
Well, everybody felt good about it, I guess, at the EPA, that they did a green bus program. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Representative DeGette, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Donnell, welcome. We're happy to have you here today. I really believe the EPA Inspector General does important work to protect taxpayer funds, and that includes conducting audits and investigations, issuing reports, and of course, like you are here today, testifying in front of Congress to highlight concerns or other findings. And even when that work does not include recommendations or produce any findings of waste, fraud, or abuse, it's really a tool to highlight that the risks EPA might face, especially considering some of the recent influxes of cash. That's why I really think it would have been helpful. I was the chair of the Oversight Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce for some years and the ranking member in other years. And I always found it helpful to have the agency here to talk about their response when we have the IG here, because Of course, many of the things that you've identified are issues that the agency needs to address. However, I noticed that this hearing is entitled, quote, "Holding the Biden-Harris EPA Accountable for Radical Rush to Green Spending," end quote. And of course, the election's about 5.5 weeks away, so I guess that's really not the purpose of this hearing. Mr. Chairman, I would welcome having people from the agency. We've had Administrator Regan in here before, but not to address these specific allegations. And I think it would be really useful, perhaps in a lame duck session or in the 119th Congress. We'd love to have you come back and help really address some of these concerns, because we want to avoid waste, fraud, and abuse. Sadly, that doesn't seem to me to be the purpose of this hearing. So I want to ask you just a couple of questions. Last year, you testified that EPA could face supply chain or production issues that could cause delays in administering the Clean School Bus Program, and that an initial audit examining those programs was ongoing. So the audit, as it turns out, did not find any evidence that significant supply chain issues or production delays had impacted the 2022 Clean School Bus Rebate Program. Is that correct?
We found issues and supply chain issues with respect to the chargers.
Okay, but page 5 of the 2023 audit says, quote, "There were no significant supply chain issues or production delays." Is that correct?
For the buses, that's right.
That's correct. Now, while the report mentioned the potential for other delays that were out of the scope of the audit, you made no recommendations related to supply chain issues or the production delays in your report after completing the audit. Is that correct?
That's right.
Now, I think it's really important to clarify that, because earlier this week, the committee Republicans published a report that appears to take a different message from your initial audit and from your past testimony. And so I just want this for the record, Mr. Chairman. In multiple OIG reports, the IG did not identify any waste, fraud, or abuse within the Clean School Bus Program. Apparently, committee Republicans appear to have misunderstood those reports, because they've spent months writing a report that's clearly meant to undermine the Clean School Bus Program and mislead the public about the findings in the reports. This is exactly what my Democratic colleagues and I were warning, Mr. O'Donnell, when you testified last year. So I just want to say the work that EPA OIG does is, as I said at the beginning, it's essential to constructive oversight of the EPA, but I really think it's important not to misconstrue the agency's testimony. And one thing that you said I'm concerned about, and I think we need to investigate further, is this lack of coordination with the criminal division. I don't know about that, and so, Mr. Chairman, again, perhaps we can have somebody come in and talk to us about that coordination and see what the agency's perspective is. Again, thank you for coming today, such that it is. I look forward to continuing to work with you in the future, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Joyce, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank you, Chairman Carter, for holding today's hearing, and you, Mr. O'Donnell, for testifying on the critical issue of oversight of potential waste at the EPA. During the Biden-Harris administration, the EPA's budget has grown from a little over $9 billion to $10.1 billion, an increase of 10% in just 4 years. On top of this, the IIJA and the IRA greatly increased the resources that EPA has to distribute. The IIJA gave the EPA $60 billion in taxpayers' money over 5 years, and that was the single largest appropriation for EPA ever. The IRA followed with allocating EPA $41.5 billion of taxpayers' money to distribute over 10 years. The EPA is already struggling with managing the large influx of funding for existing programs like the state revolving funds, let alone the entirely new programs for which the EPA has no experience, and even the recipients may have no experience. Given the vast amount of funds that the EPA has now been flooded with, it is critical that there is strong oversight. Quite honestly, your job got tougher. The IG's office at the EPA needs to be active and aggressive in attacking abuse and fraud. Mr. O'Donnell, would you elaborate on the challenges that the EPA faces to safeguard the taxpayers' money?
I think you've heard from the agency on personnel issues, and it's an issue that we often find is there's a shortage of workforce for the purposes of grant management, data management.
In your office, do you have workforce issues right now?
In my office, you talk about how the EPA's budget has increased by 10%. My office since 2011 has decreased by perhaps 20%.
Are there open positions in your office for the oversight that we all know is necessary?
Only to fill people who have left. We've had to shrink our workforce, our core workforce, over the last year.
Mr. O'Donnell, we've already discussed the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Do you have confidence, based on your experience with other established programs, that the EPA has the data and the experience to monitor this massive spending?
I think I have concerns about it. Those concerns I think the EPA has as well, given the breadth and the scope of and the complexity. I cannot say enough about how complex these programs are going to be. It is as if the agency is funding an investment bank that will do equity, it'll do fixed income, it will do complex financial transactions. As I said yesterday, the agency was kind enough to give us a presentation on how they'll use a private bank.
Should the agency be an investment bank? I'm perplexed by that response.
Well, it is, I think it's unusual.
I think it's more than unusual. I think we should be looking at this quite seriously, as these are taxpayer dollars that need to be used in a really judicious manner to be able to understand, and your responsibilities are to make sure that those guardrails are in place to see that there is a responsible stewardship of those taxpayer dollars. In your talk, in your testimony about the general resistance of EPA to bring examples of waste and fraud to your attention, can you elaborate on this and what it means for holding recipients accountable?
We have had instances where the EPA is aware of attempts to defraud them or actually defraud them, and instead of bringing those to our attention, they ignore them or will wait for many months, and in doing so, really undermine our ability to refer a criminal or civil case.
How do you get that line of communication so there's not long time gaps before this is brought to your attention, these months that you're talking about?
It's got to be a cultural thing at the EPA that their first.
Can you change that culture at the EPA from your leadership? Do you have the capabilities of doing that?
We try. We have a program to reward agency whistleblowers who identify waste, fraud, and abuse that we actually can recover.
Are there examples where these whistleblowers have stepped forward and then you've had to take the necessary steps?
We have not yet paid anyone out. I'm waiting to, but we have not. No one has come to us yet.
My time is expiring, but I do have a request that the follow-up occurs, that when there are these cases that occur, when whistleblowers, when your internal guardrails come into play, because yet they're not, would you please let this committee know? Because I think it's important because of the significant funds that are now turned into the EPA's hands because of the taxpayer dollars, which have now been transferred to the EPA. We need to make sure that waste, fraud, and abuse is not rampant. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, and I thank you for being here today.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Representative Sarbanes, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell, for being here. You said a moment again, I think you've been emphasizing that, this is complex. And it reminded me of this quote from President Kennedy when he said, we do things not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept that we are unwilling to postpone and one we intend to win. So I would put this effort in that category, trying to do hard things because they make a difference and they'll take us to a different level. Safe, reliable drinking water is a fundamental right. Unfortunately, our nation's drinking water infrastructure is aging and underfunded. This means frequent leaks, potential drinking water contamination, and inefficient water management, which can drive up families' utility bills and threaten public health. IIJA, as we've discussed, is investing $50 billion to improve our nation's water infrastructure, long overdue down payment, helping communities make needed improvements to their water systems, create good-paying jobs, put money back into Americans' pockets. It's largely allocated, as we know, through the state revolving funds, or SRFs. You recently issued a management implication report on SRFs that said, quote, states may voluntarily conduct annual independent audits, end quote, of drinking water SRFs, but are not required to do so. The report also says states that do not perform voluntary audits are subject to periodic EPA OIG audits. While I understand the majority of states do in fact perform voluntary audits, some don't. My question is, are you performing periodic audits of drinking water SRFs for states that are not performing voluntary annual audits?
My office has not done that probably for 15 years.
How long?
15 years. A decision was made by a previous acting IG that we would no longer participate in this, but I felt it part of our responsibility under the regulation, and of course as overseers of these funds to return ourselves to this. So what you're talking about, that management implication report, was us reintroducing ourselves to the SRFs, reminding them that they are required to submit these if they're doing them so we can review them, make the decision with respect to the drinking water, whether we need to do something about it on ourselves. And then that management implication report is, if you will, the result of that request. How many could actually get us? And it was both clean water and drinking water. How many could respond to us?
We're all, including EPA, obviously committed to ensuring that this critical investment is getting to the communities who need it, and the benefit of using the SRFs to administer the funds is that it leverages EPA's decades of experience. While a mature program even isn't immune from waste, fraud, and abuse, the Drinking Water SRF has a track record as an effective funding mechanism for critical water infrastructure projects. It has been successful in offering low-interest loans and other financial assistance tools that allow communities to tackle large-scale projects. To that end, IIJA also provided $15 billion in dedicated funding to identify and replace lead service lines distributed through the Drinking Water SRF. The lead funding included in IIJA provides a historic opportunity to help communities get the lead out once and for all. For the first time, America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018 required EPA to gather information about lead service lines. This information allowed EPA to allocate funds based on the estimated need to replace lead pipes rather than on the overall water infrastructure needs of a state. Your office also issued a management alert about the lead service line allocations to states, and I understand an audit related to that alert is still being conducted. Can you give us an update on when we can expect the evaluation?
I believe the draft report is with the agency, so probably in the next 30, 60 days. Next 30 to 60 days.
Okay. We know there's no safe level of lead and that exposure is preventable. Far too many Americans have been and continue to be exposed to toxic lead from their pipes. Democrats and the Biden-Harris administration are committed to providing communities the tools and resources needed to remove all lead pipes once and for all. While many communities lack comprehensive inventories, water systems have been working to fill those gaps, and this crucial funding can be used to support those efforts. In the meantime, EPA has mechanisms in place like reallocations that can be used if states do not have enough eligible projects. However, based on the many estimates that have been published, I imagine the need is great, and in fact, more resources will be required to address this problem. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, Representative McMorris Rogers, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Mr. O'Donnell, welcome back to the committee. The scale and pace of new spending for the EPA only underscores our concerns about their ability to effectively manage this spending. You've indicated that EPA is not collecting the right information. Last year, you testified that EPA lacks an internal audit function. To your knowledge, has EPA taken steps to establish an internal audit function since last year?
I'm not aware of any steps that they're taking at this point.
I've introduced legislation to set up a pilot internal audit function by requiring EPA to provide for an independent audit of EPA's activities and spending, including grants for its Clean Air Act activities. 18 state attorney generals came out in support of the Audit Act, and I'd like to submit a letter of support for the record.
Without objection.
From your experience, Mr. O'Donnell, do you think EPA conducting internal audits would improve transparency and help protect taxpayer interest?
I think it would be an incredible tool to assist management in making good decisions and be able to track the performance of their programs.
Thank you. As a follow-up to some of the questions related to the $27 billion so-called National Clean Investment Fund, and that is being managed like an investment fund. Is the person in charge of managing this a banker, or do they have any kind of financial experience?
There are people there who I believe are, I don't know their status at the EPA, but have had some experience in investment banking. There are a couple.
Okay, we'll keep looking into that. The committee highlighted numerous concerns about the Clean School Bus Program in the report released earlier this week. Without objection, I'd like to enter that into the record.
Without objection.
In December of 2022, your office reported that potential delays in utilities constructing charging stations could limit recipient school districts' ability to have their buses up and running in a timely manner. Your report also noted, quote, the impact of utility issues on the program will not be fully known until the 2022 selectees close out their rebates, and that's not scheduled until October of 24. We wrote to the EPA administrator just this past April, asking, as of that date, how many selectees under the program had received their buses and how many have started using them. The EPA declined to answer that question, stating it will have more information after October. Do you have a sense of whether most recipients will meet the October 24 deadline to close out this process?
I am not certain. I know we have an ongoing audit, and I don't want to, it's near finished on the status of those funds and how they're being expended. And I think that will help to illuminate your question.
Do you know how many charging stations have been built?
No, I don't.
Okay. Earlier this year, your office recommended that if an applicant requested funding for electric school buses, the EPA should establish procedures to verify that this type of bus is even suitable for that school district. The EPA declined to implement that recommendation. What is your view of EPA's management of the program?
I think our reports speak to it, that there's room for improvement.
So this is a $5 billion program. 50% of it was to go to electric school buses and 50% were to go to other clean options. What is your understanding as to how many school buses have qualified under this program?
My understanding is that most of the money, 50%, as you say, go to the electric school buses, and with respect to the other 50%, the majority of that tends to be the electric school buses as well.
Yes, and you'll find in our report that I submitted to the record that the electric school buses are 3 to 4 times other clean alternatives, and yet the EPA is focusing on the buses on only funding, or largely as like 95, 98% of the buses that they're funding are the electric school buses. We're also having challenges manufacturing those buses or having charging stations that are actually available to the school districts. I appreciate the work that you're doing. Can you speak to when EPA was authorized by Congress to begin with?
Well, the EPA was created by an executive order from President Nixon.
Has it ever been authorized? Has the EPA ever been authorized by Congress?
Not directly. The environmental laws are the organic statutes, if you will, of the EPA.
Well, thank you for being here again. We'll keep asking more questions. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Inspector General for testifying, and I appreciate your years of oversight work, particularly on the Superfund sites. Ensuring programs benefits from constructive oversight should be a bipartisan goal, but unfortunately, Republicans have taken a different path as Congress, engaging in political theater to undermine critical Inflation Reduction Act programs that they opposed, even as these same programs are benefiting their districts. And frankly, this partisanship is not based on reality. After all, many programs are just getting off the ground and funds are just starting to flow in some cases. But let me get to the question. Inspector General O'Donnell, yes or no, to date, have you issued any reports that found waste, fraud, abuse in the Inflation Reduction Act programs?
No. I think we've only issued one, but no, not in that one.
Oh, you mean you've only issued one report?
One report, that's
But nothing that indicates waste, fraud, or abuse so far, correct?
in reports, that's right.
Okay. Now, I wanted to, obviously I support the funding that the OIG uses to conduct oversight, and I support your work, but what I don't want to see, as I've mentioned, is the politicization of oversight to attack programs such as the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the Environmental Justice Grants programs. These are things that my Republican colleagues simply don't like, and so they say, well, they're not being conducted properly. But the politicization of EPA oversight is of concern because we saw the same thing during the last administration, during the Trump administration. In 2019, this committee received a 7-day letter from your office about a senior Trump political appointee who was obstructing OIG oversight by refusing to cooperate with an OIG investigation as required by law and EPA policy. And my understanding is that these 7-day letters are one of the most powerful tools that Congress gave to inspector generals to draw attention to flagrant problems at an agency that created a risk of waste or fraud or abuse. So let me ask you, Inspector General O'Donnell, have you issued any 7-day letters since January 2021? Yes or no?
No.
Okay.
But like you said, they're so rare that
Right.
I don't think anyone has issued one since then, any IG.
Well, that's good, but what I think it shows you that under the Democrats, we're not politicizing the OIG like the Republicans did under President Trump. What is your threshold to consider using or issuing a 7-day letter, if I could ask? What's the threshold?
For me personally, it would be extraordinarily high.
Okay. So, again, you've not identified any issues at EPA that rise to that threshold. I think the problem I have, and I always go back to this playbook, Trump's Project 2025, that would, in my opinion, reinvigorate these previous attempts to politicize the EPA, eliminate the independence of the EPA, starve it of resources, eliminate programs that do not support Republicans' agenda. I mean, I don't know if Project 2025 just says, let's get rid of the EPA, but they certainly would do everything possible to get rid of the EPA or to make it completely ineffective. And I think that's a clear difference between the Trump and the Biden-Harris administrations in terms of their support or lack of support in the case of the Republicans of the EPA. And what I think is so important and what bothers me the most is that we've got to put scientific integrity, oversight, transparency, at the forefront. And, if we want to ensure that EPA fulfills its mission to protect public health and the environment, there's nothing wrong with talking about the science and doing the oversight and having more transparency, but I don't see that happening here. I think everything on the Republican side is pursuant to this Trump Project 2025 playbook that essentially tries to, eliminate the EPA's independence, starve its resources, and eliminate programs that the Republicans don't support. And I just don't want to go back to that again the way we did under the 4 years when Trump was president. But thank you, Thank you, Mr.
I
O'Donnell.
think, I
appreciate
would just say, I agree with you with respect to scientific integrity and the importance of it. And this is why, for us, it's so important that the EPA put into procedures that we are the appropriate reporting mechanism, because we are the only entity in the EPA that can protect the confidentiality of whistleblowers.
And that's true for the inspector generals and all the agencies.
exactly-
So I appreciate that. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, sir. Mr. O'Donnell, in your written testimony, you acknowledged that the EPA has a history of challenges while distributing grants. I'm quoting now, quote, "The EPA has struggled to establish and maintain efficient operations for distributing billions of dollars in grants. The challenge has been magnified by the IIJA and IRA funds flowing through the EPA to non-federal entities," which is not a good sign, end quote. "With the shot clock to distribute billions of taxpayer dollars allocated by the IRA by the end of this fiscal year, you know how many days that is from now?"
Days.
It's
Two
a-
weeks, less than
It's 11.
Yes.
It's 11 days into the fiscal year. What assurances do we have that number one, my question is going to be, what assurances do we have that the EPA will ensure that the recipients of this money will actually be responsible for acting in accordance with the laws and regulations? Does it concern you that we're this close to the end of a fiscal year and that's a problem?
Well, I've been very clear on this, and I want to add, I've not only been clear about this, but the agency has. Zealand Hoover came and testified and spoke about our indispensable role in ensuring exactly what you said, that funds are given out appropriately and laws and regulations are followed. But unfortunately, it's at this point very difficult for us to fulfill that role that the agency envisions.
So if it's difficult, what actions can you take? And I've got your office, and I've got several questions. Who tracks it? For how long? Who reports that to who? And when, especially in the light of the next question, where in January 2024, your office issued a report identifying the EPA's initial reporting of its FY 2022 spending in USA spending.gov was incomplete and inaccurate. How can we know for sure that you're getting good information, that something's actually going to be done to support, to protect taxpayers' investment? How can you guarantee us that?
I think we've done a good job with IIJA because we were given money for oversight, and the EPA recognizes if we were involved, you would have more assurance that that money is being spent.
It doesn't give me a lot of hope. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield some time to the gentleman from Alabama, if I may.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to go back to an answer that you gave me that I got the impression it was diffused by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about a misappropriated grant to a school district. Could you clarify that?
Yes. So in our management implication report, we talk about a school district that was an administrative entity, and we could determine this through open source information, and they received money to buy a clean school bus, but they don't have any students. They don't report having any students.
Okay, and do you have any instances where applicants being awarded funding despite violating the program requirements in the application?
We have seen that, yes, we see that at the EPA.
Does the Clean School Bus Program present opportunities for communities to double dip into these funds?
That is something that we are concerned about. I think that a forthcoming audit will be a starting point for us.
Okay, I think it's important to find out who the individual is who's managing this investment bank for the EPA and as to whether or not they have banking experience. I know Mr. Hoover came in and testified, but he has a double major in political science, peace, war, and defense, which he may be pretty good at managing his personal finances, but I have some questions about whether or not he can manage a $27 billion Green New Deal investment bank. So I just think that this is something extremely important to the American people. We can argue about the science. We can argue about whether or not it's politics, it's climate politics or climate science. I tend to think it's climate political science, honestly. And we're going in the wrong direction, but that's an issue for another day. I do appreciate the gentleman yielding time to me, and I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Thank the gentleman, and continuing what the ranking member was insinuating. In fact, no, he wasn't implying, he was stating that, Republicans want to do away with the EPA and they don't care about all this stuff and blah, 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 blah. But the point of the matter is, we're talking about taxpayer money here. And so because if we're making sure that when you've got a report from the EPA in 2022 that's inaccurate and incomplete, and we have a problem with that, and the other side has a problem with us wanting to make sure that taxpayer dollars are being spent what they were meant for and efficiently and effectively and as reasonably as possible, call us guilty as charged. We're looking out for taxpayers. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes Representative Clark for 5 minutes of questioning.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Tonko, for holding this hearing today. And I thank Inspector General O'Donnell for being here to testify. Exhaust from diesel-burning school buses poses serious threats to the health of children, bus drivers, and surrounding communities. This pollution has been linked to asthma, cancer, and cognitive development impacts. Through the bipartisan infrastructure law, House Democrats delivered a historic $5 billion to EPA for the deployment of zero and low emission school buses to address this alarming threat to public health. Your office recently released a report on the Clean School Bus Program titled, "The EPA Needs to Improve Internal Controls for Selecting Recipients of Clean School Bus Program Funds." I was initially concerned by the title of the report, but was pleased to discover that the EPA met 6 out of 7 of the requirements. You made 4 recommendations, 3 of which EPA agreed with and has taken action to address. And I'd like to get some clarity on your 4th recommendation, that the EPA should establish procedures to verify the zero-emission school buses are suitable for applicants. In EPA's response to your recommendations on suitability, EPA stated that fleet owners are best positioned to know their own unique needs. That sounds reasonable to me. The schools and school administrators in my district definitely understand the needs of the community better than someone far removed from the students they serve. And Congress was clear in the law about who is eligible to receive funding and what technology is eligible to receive funding. This concept of suitability does not appear. Inspector General, can you please point to where you found language requiring that the EPA verify that zero-emission school buses are suitable for applicants in the statute?
I seem to recall there is a requirement that suitability be consideration for a grant under the program.
Well, I want to thank you for that, but I'll tell you, it's not in the statute. While I value the important work that you do and will continue to support giving the EPA OIG additional resources for oversight, I want to make certain that your findings and recommendations are clear, especially when it comes to overwhelmingly popular programs like the Clean School Bus Program. If your reports are not clear, I worry that some readers may misunderstand your findings, which would harm EPA's ability to manage programs that are already working well. I know we both want the EPA to succeed, so I strongly encourage you to keep this in mind for future reports. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Carter, for holding this important hearing. And I want to thank you, Inspector General, for your work, for being here today to testify. I'll start by saying that I've been very concerned by the overreach of the Environmental Protection Agency under the Biden-Harris administration. It's been the most extreme EPA with their spending and regulatory policies. The EPA regulatory agenda has made things harder, for example, for farmers in my district, especially with access to imported chemicals used by our farmers, which are being restricted, like dicamba. Additionally, the emission rule for heavy-duty vehicles and the final rule to designate FOA and FOAS and the 2 common PFAS substances as hazardous materials under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act hamstrings my farmers who are trying to feed and clothe our nation. This brings up questions regarding the scientific decisions the EPA makes. And I bring this up, we've got one of the finest research universities in the country there in Athens, Georgia. And, they're doing research every day to provide us with the most efficient, most abundant food supply in the world. A lot of talent there. And the EPA is being funded far beyond what we're funding research universities. But what I'm hearing is, and I'm hearing this, is that the EPA can't recruit the talent to actually know the science behind these things. Obviously, we're sitting here today. We are in the last 365 days, we've run up about 2.4 trillion more in debt. And, we can't continue that. And so we're saying, hey, where's the money going here? And what is the expertise? I mean, we hear all these statistics. Where's the actual scientific data by actual trained researchers? I mean, people who have the credentials to do the research in this. We're a nation governed by laws, not by unelected bureaucrats. This administration's EPA has made much of promoting its scientific integrity policy, but a true defense of robust, unbiased scientific assessments and conclusions, which I support, is different than using political science to deflect poorer statutory compliance achieved with similar resources as other administrations. Please speak about your recent findings on EPA's scientific integrity policy and the Biden EPA forwarding compliant identities to senior career managers as well as the manager named in the complaint.
Our reports note that managers, and truth be told, I know that this can seem like a partisan volleyball, but all of this occurred with respect to the career staff at the GS-15 level and below, but after the complaints were filed, those were circulated among the staff, and I have to tell you, as a matter of best practice, that has a real chilling effect on the willingness of whistleblowers, subsequent whistleblowers, to come forward, which is why we raised it in our reports.
Why has the agency resisted OIG oversight on this policy, including report claims of retaliation, retribution, or reprisal?
I don't know why.
Why does EPA delay corrective actions of scientific integrity activities?
I don't know why.
Earlier this year, EPA proposed and then finalized adjustment factors to so-called FEM, Federal Equivalent Method monitors that were approved for use by the EPA in 2016 as a substitute for the air monitors traditionally used to measure PM 2.5 concentrations. I don't expect you to be familiar with this, but when you hear about data inaccuracies and your testimony is talking about data inaccuracies across EPA's programs, do you think an audit of EPA's practices relating to air monitoring could be warranted?
Well, I'm happy to report that we just announced an audit of money spent under ARPA and the IRA on these community-based air monitorings.
Well, this raises several troubling issues over the process taken by this agency and the accuracy of the data. And certainly, this is not political. This is Congress's responsibility. Oversight is our responsibility. We're a guardian of the American people. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Representative Barragan, for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Inflation Reduction Act includes an unprecedented investment to protect our most vulnerable communities from environmental harm, protect us, through the historic $3 billion in climate and environmental justice block grants. This historic program will deliver the resources that environmental justice communities have long needed but never received. Inspector General O'Donnell, to date, you have not issued any report that finds waste, fraud, or abuse in the climate and environmental justice block grant program established in the Inflation Reduction Act, correct?
We have not done any audits or evaluations related to the environmental justice program.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's critical that to ensure oversight that protects the integrity of these funds meant to support EJ communities while also helping new grantees navigate the responsibilities as recipients of the funding. For some marginalized and historically disadvantaged communities, this is the first time they have applied for a federal grant. It can be intimidating to work with the federal government. It's important that EPA works with them to provide the necessary technical assistance to implement grant funding. It's also important to make certain that as oversight is conducted, these communities are not unintentionally stigmatized or discouraged from seeking federal assistance they need and are eligible to receive. Mr. O'Donnell, what steps are you taking to ensure that your efforts to provide oversight do not unintentionally discourage low-income communities and communities of color from seeking federal assistance from the Inflation Reduction Act programs or future Justice 40 investments made by Congress?
So for us, and I think this is in line with what you were saying, when we look at the dollars spent, our focus isn't on the recipient, it's not on that applicant, it's on the beneficiaries. We want to make sure, and I think this is a matter of environmental justice, that the recipients pass through that money and that the beneficiaries are the ones, those communities are the ones that receive the benefit of
Yeah,
that.
but are you taking any steps to make it less intimidating for some, maybe who are working with the federal government for the first time?
Well, we wouldn't facilitate the application for a loan or those sorts of things. We, of course, encourage the agency to have strong internal controls with respect to this. I think the agency is mindful of the concerns that you've raised, but I'd let them speak to that.
Well, thank you. I think constructive oversight is key to ensuring programs succeed, and it's important for us to make sure that this oversight of EPA's programs is proportional to the size and the capacity of the recipient organizations, especially nonprofits or small cities with maybe less experience in federal funding. Mr. O'Donnell, in the audits you plan to conduct on the Inflation Reduction Act programs, will you assess how effectively EPA provides technical assistance to recipient organizations in Justice 40 communities to ensure they have the tools they need to manage and implement their grants?
So I don't know that we have that specific audit, but it's something we'd be interested in. And I want to add to my previous, if you will, one thing that we do, that we continue to do, even though we're not funded, is we do a great deal of outreach to recipients and communities to try and, in an appropriate, clear language way, explain to them what the red flags are for fraud indicators, and kind of put a personal face on the OIG.
Okay, is there any follow-up that's done to make sure the implementation of the grant is done as it should be done, or any tools that they're given, technical assistance?
Well, that would be an important part of our work, grant closeout and like.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, my Republican colleagues have spent this entire Congress searching for any reason to justify cuts to investments in environmental justice communities. Constructive oversight can help these programs succeed and mitigate identified risks, but what committee Republicans have done for the last 2 years has been more about obstructing progress than effective oversight. I urge my colleagues to support and protect these historic investments in environmental justice communities instead of relentlessly attacking them. We should be focused on ensuring these programs fulfill their promise, not trying to limit EPA's ability to deliver results. And I can tell you that, there's been conversation about taxpayer-funded dollars, and this is really about helping communities. It's about making sure that they can move toward getting cleaner air and getting the resources that they need. And I think even in red parts of this country and in Republican areas, they would appreciate that cleaner air, cleaner ability to breathe, the better ability to breathe, because that's not a Democrat or Republican issue, and I think this really is something we should continue to work on together so that we can provide this progress. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Iowa, Dr. Miller Meeks, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witness for testifying before the committee today. This November will mark 3 years since the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was signed into law. The supplemental appropriations under the IIJA doubled EPA's typical appropriations for each year of the 5-year funding period. The The IRA, which just turned 2 years old, appropriated over $41 billion to the EPA over a decade, with massive funding levels going to ill-defined programs such as the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and environmental justice block grants, as we just heard. The administration and my Democrat colleagues are throwing a lot of money towards so-called energy transition without a real sense of how these programs and the EPA's regulatory actions will impact economic well-being and net global emissions. For example, the EPA is trying to force closure of existing power plants with the Clean Power Plan 2.0 rule without a subsequent plan in place to meet growing electricity demand, especially with AI and data centers coming on board. While Iowa is powered by 60% renewable energy and we are a net energy exporter of clean energy, it's important to remember that nationwide, coal and natural gas are still 60% of our nation's electricity generation, and globally, 600,000 people die of heat or cold, the vast majority of cold from not having affordable energy for their homes. So we risk creating energy poverty. So I think it's important that we are accounting for where these billions of dollars are going and if the funds are actually helping to improve the environment and address the increasing energy demand. Mr. O'Donnell, what's the status of your IIJA oversight plan? And do you have future work planned for IIJA oversight beyond what's described in the latest oversight plan?
We take seriously the requirement that we keep Congress and the administrator currently and fully informed. Plans are malleable, they grow. So what we try and focus on is what we're going to do as far as specific projects for 1 year, and then we look on the out years and talk about general areas. And I think with respect to our plan, we've talked about things like grant closeout and the like.
And the status is on track or
yes,
behind?
yes.
Thank you.
And if I may, just very quickly, and I've done a disservice to my evaluators. When we publish a report, it goes through a very rigorous review and quality assurance process. So when our reports say something is this or that, I have unimpeachable confidence in that. So.
Thank you. On December 7th, 2022, the OIG published a review of 28 prior reports on EPA's use of $7.2 billion under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. In it, the OIG reported on 3 lessons that the EPA should consider to mitigate risks and reduce the likelihood of fraud, waste, and abuse of IIJA funds. What are those 3 factors?
Oh, boy. I don't recall. Yeah, we'll get back to you on that one.
Well, I'm surprised you can't recall, but my follow-up question was going to be, how is the EPA following those recommendations? But if you're not aware of what those recommendations are, that's a little bit...
I remember some of them. I don't want to remember all.
That's a little bit problematic. So what level of confidence should Congress have in the agency's ability to handle such a significant amount of money and requirements, including from the additional items in the IIJA and IRA?
So we are in the process of planning a follow-up to that to see where they have, how they have responded from that roll-up into 2 or 3 years into the program.
It's not very confidence-inspiring that you don't know what the recommendations were. Is the EPA's data management proficiency a challenge in managing the new grant programs created through the IIJA or the IRA?
Yes, that has been we have identified that as a top management challenge to the EPA.
And do you have a plan for how to meet that management challenge?
Yes, we have ongoing oversight work in that area.
Right. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Before you yield back, can you yield me some time?
Yes, sir. More than happy to yield.
Thank you. Let me ask you something. Earlier, Representative Palmer asked you about subgrants, and Representative Berrigan also touched on this. How far do you follow the money? Do you follow it all the way until it's spent? I mean, does the EPA have to give a grantee permission to give a subgrant?
I believe that's part of in the terms and conditions of the grant. There will be the notion of a subrecipient.
So when they propose their program for a grant, does it include that we're going to give a sub-grant to this person or to this?
Well, it depends on the program. You know, for us, I think this is in the context one was in the context of, I think, the TikToks that the EPA calls them, and for earlier discussions, it was with respect to the SRFs, which by their nature have subrecipients.
Right, and I thank the lady for yielding, and
I yield back.
the gentlelady yields back. Is she ready? The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Representative Schakowsky, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The good news that we've had over the Biden administration is that what we've seen has been enormous amount of investment from the bipartisan infrastructure law and then also the Inflation Reduction Act that has really provided opportunities for commerce and for jobs all across the country. And it seems to me that that has been a big benefit for the environment and, as I say, for workers and for business. So I wanted to ask Mr. O'Donnell, have you done a report on exactly really what has been done, and will you do that if you have not, that talks about the number of jobs that have been created, the success of the legislation that has been passed, talking
We've
about
started to
these
look at that.
issues?
Yeah, I think we have issued a report on, a very recent report on the EPA's compliance with the Justice 40 program. Are they meeting the goals of that program, along the lines of what you said? And we found that they are meeting the goals of that program, overstating the benefits slightly, but they are meeting the goals. And we will continue to do that as this money progresses out.
I think it's really important that people understand what actually the legislation that passed, and I say it, the infrastructure was a bipartisan bill, how much it really did for them. We have over and over again had hearings from the majority party, from the Republicans, to go after the Environmental Protection Agency. Things like trying to make the air cleaner, help people breathing, like in Chicago, where asthma is such a problem in so many communities. And I don't understand why there has been such a attack over and over again on the Environmental Protection Agency, when I think we have so many things that can be put out to the public that have directly benefited them all over the country, the things that have been happening. So we need to be mindful, I think, of getting that information out. I've raised that before at a hearing that we had, and I'd like to see that kind of report. With that, I'm going to yield back.
Excuse me. Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, from Ohio, Representative Balderson, for 5 minutes of questioning. My apologies.
No worries, Mr. Chairman. My dear friend from Pennsylvania is right next door. Thank you, Chairman Carter, for holding this hearing today, and Mr. O'Donnell for you being here today and help us conduct some oversight in out-of-control EPA. First, I'd like to echo a sentiment you expressed in your testimony. I strongly agree that the $100 billion in new funding for the EPA from the IIJA and the IRA doesn't belong to the EPA. It is taxpayer money, and we must ensure the EPA is managing this funding in accordance with federal laws. Mr. O'Donnell, we've talked a little bit about some of the concerns with the money, but you also discussed your concerns with the data quality issues with the EPA's regional offices. Can you expand on why better data management is needed to ensure program performance and track the success of the grants that the EPA has issued?
These grants are intended for outcomes, and the only way the EPA can really measure across the enterprise of whether they're meeting those outcomes is from good data.
Thank you. Any response to your whistleblower report that was issued this week? The EPA said, since day one, the Biden-Harris administration has restored scientific integrity as the cornerstone of its work to protect public health and the environment, including reinstating key whistleblower protections that empower employees to share their own differing scientific opinions. It's my understanding that your report found that many of these retaliatory actions occurred in 2021 and 2022. So, would you agree with the statement from the EPA?
I think I've read that statement one time. I believe that the retaliatory acts occurred in 2020. Our concern in 2021 and 22 was the circulating of the names of whistleblowers. For us, the confidentiality of whistleblowers is paramount, and that was lost when those names were circulated.
Okay, thank you. This past July, your office issued a report on the Clean or Zero Emission School Bus Program. The report found that the EPA did not require funding applicants to provide sufficient program eligibility documentation. However, as noted in the report, the EPA's guidance on that $5 billion program states that it will conduct random reviews of applications and post-award documentation. Mr. O'Donnell, I know we've discussed the school bus program a little bit today, but can you expand on why these random reviews are insufficient to adequately prevent waste, fraud, and abuse of the program?
At my confirmation hearing how many years ago, I reflected on this notion that Justice Holmes said that we're expected to cut square corners in dealing with the government. And I think that it's very important that the EPA ensure that everyone who comes to them is cutting those square corners because they're really getting the benefit of the American taxpayer dollar.
Doesn't this mean that in some cases the funding would have already been distributed to the recipient by the time the EPA detects a problem?
It could.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to Mr. O'Donnell for being here. Excuse me. We do need robust oversight to ensure that when Congress creates programs, we can make sure every dollar is spent as we intended. And the problem I have with today's hearing is that in some respects, the majority isn't walking the walk. Every time Mr. O'Donnell expresses the need for funding for proper oversight, which he has at 3 hearings now, the majority introduces a dead-on-arrival funding bill that does not include the necessary funding for that oversight. This will not ensure that taxpayer dollars are spent properly, and it's not going to get money into Mr. O'Donnell's office. Mr. Inspector General, it is my understanding that EPA's FY 2025 budget request called for an additional $20 million for your office. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
And does the latest CR from House Republicans include those additional funds to meet EPA's OIG's budgetary needs?
I'm sorry, I haven't read this CR.
I don't. The answer is no. But that's my problem with today's hearing. I think oversight is a bipartisan issue. We can and should work together to make sure we aren't wasting taxpayer dollars. I talked to you also about something we might agree on in terms of getting the benefit out of IRA and the infrastructure bill, which is permit reform to make things go faster and avoid delays. That's not specifically your issue, but it is one of the concerns I have about waste in deploying these bills, which I think are worthy efforts. But I'd appreciate the opportunity to work in a bipartisan way to fully fund the OIG, and it doesn't have to be partisan. This hearing is not about the needs of OIG, and it isn't about oversight. It's just another opportunity for the majority to highlight programs they don't like and problems that we have a tough time solving together without evidence of waste, fraud, or abuse to back up those complaints. And I think we should focus on funding the government, meeting all of our obligations to the American people, and we should work to conduct real oversight and stop waste, fraud, and abuse in every form. I'd love to support your office with the funding you need to do your part. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Representative Pence, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Tonko, and thank you, Administrator, for appearing here today. Back in a former life, I was Chief Deputy Commissioner of the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, and that was a long time ago, and the dollars were much, much less than they are now. I've been raising alarms about the impacts of this administration rush to electrify our transportation and manufacturing industry. I've hosted probably about 8 roundtables back in Indiana. I have the state of Indiana sitting there, utilities, research universities, Purdue, Vincennes, parking and mobility experts and charging station developers that have told me about lessons learned, where they were at, the grants they were applying for, the monies that the state has received. In these roundtables, I've recently heard some troubling stories about the current state of the green transition. I'll get into that in a second. Recently, the governor of Indiana, Eric Holcomb, said, let's invest in innovation. Let's not set goals that are out of reach. I'll continue to advocate for more investment like we're doing here in the state of Indiana to embrace alternative resources. So we're pro moving forward with all of the above. Inspector General, in your written testimony, and I quote, you said, in my previous testimony, I warned of some of the risks that managing such a massive influx of resources create. And then just a second ago, Chairman Carter asked you how it's going on the follow-up and seeing how this money is used. And then when I walked in here, you said something, and I really didn't hear it, but I think the gist was you're operating at a loss because the demand is far exceeds what you're supposed to inspect, regulate, oversee. I'm here to share with you today that the state of Indiana, they got enormous sums of money in 2021, and they can't do it. They can't do it because of the delays in permitting, the delays in how you actually can qualify for deploying the funds. There are companies that have set up, they're ready to do these things regardless of what it is, develop alternative. I have heavy duty Cummins Engine Companies in my hometown, which the EPA has been very generous with. But moving forward with the science and the implementation just seems to be tremendously bogged down, and yet the dollars are out there. Am I misunderstanding something? Is that correct?
I'm not sure how much of the money the EPA has actually spent with respect to IIJ. I believe it's 10 to 20%, but it's such an enormous amount of money that.
Enormous amount, and would you agree that it's actually not being deployed the way the intention of whatever the grant was? Would you agree with that?
I think we found that in our capacity review of New Mexico, that they had financial capacity issues that were not allowing them to move the money out the way that they were expected to.
I'm sorry, say that again. What didn't allow him to move money out?
Their financial capacity and the amount of money that came in, they were not able to move IIJ money, SRF money out as fast as they were expected to.
Well, you know, sometimes whether it's a state or it's a balance sheet of a company, are they just deploying it on their balance sheet to make them look a little better? You know what I'm saying by that? I'm a little suspicious of that.
And that is something we definitely look at as well.
Good.
It is
okay.
It is a common fraud technique when grant recipients.
Yeah, I'm going to yield some time back to the chairman.
Again, I asked you earlier about how far down the line you follow the money.
Yeah.
And I'm just not comfortable with the answer yet. I mean, do you follow it till it's spent?
Right. So
we've had a problem across the board, not just with EPA, but other agencies as well. We give these grants, and then they give sub-grants, and we don't know what they're being used for.
Yes. So I think maybe in the past, my office has not. It has taken a more restrictive view. My view is that we follow every dollar until it's spent. And that includes not just to the subrecipient, but to the subrecipient's contractors. And these are the things we speak about when we talk about the need for audit. We talk about the need for better data that the SRFs and the EPA are collecting in order to know if there's, for example, bid rigging or collusion. So we will follow every dollar until it is spent.
And I know you can't speak for other IGs, but is that the normal practice of IGs?
I can't speak for everyone. When I was at the Department of Justice, I would work with some OIGs that we would follow the dollars all the way to the end.
Okay. All right, the gentleman yields back. And the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Representative Crenshaw, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you to the chair. Thank you for helping me out as I run from another committee. Mr. O'Donnell, we're obviously very worried about EPA's management of roughly $100 billion in U.S. taxpayer funds received through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the deceptively labeled Inflation Reduction Act. Of all the dubious programs, and there are many, one of the most concerning is the $30 billion for the EPA Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and Environmental Justice Block Grants, which funnels taxpayer funding directly to radical environmental groups. And shockingly, I say that with extreme sarcasm, some of these pass-throughs who are receiving IRA funding have direct ties to other organizations such as the Indigenous Environmental Network, which was responsible for the violent and illegal protests of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Moreover, many of these awarded IRA funds are directly connected to the Biden-Harris administration or other Democrat organizations. One example is David Hayes, a former special assistant to the president who now sits on the board of the Coalition for Green Capital, which received $5 billion in taxpayer money. It's hard not to read that and just, it's hard to read that and not be infuriated by what seems to be just overt corporate cronyism. And then we have to ask ourselves, what tangible benefits do Americans actually get for any of this? I mean, if you can tell me that we're going to get decades of reliable, abundant energy, clean, emission-free energy at a low cost, then you know what? That wouldn't be a terrible investment. But I'd say we're definitely not getting that. A lot of people are getting rich, but we're not getting that. They'll have you believe that these nonprofit groups are going to help prevent climate change, make our weather better, improve the environment. But the truth is EPA has little to any safeguards to ensure that this money is even spent appropriately. And, you know, I have to point out, if we were serious about reducing climate change and we had to spend $100 billion on it, then I think we would direct that money to reduce emissions by providing baseload power, like new nuclear plants. It's unclear how much more gigawatts of energy we could build with $100 billion, maybe 10, maybe whatever the number is. It's definitely more than what we're going to be creating with all of these pass-through programs. And that's assuming that solar energy actually worked all the time. Of course it doesn't, because at night it just doesn't work. It's intermittent energy. So this is a very non-pragmatic approach to clean energy. Pointed that out a million times on this committee. And I appreciate the work you all are doing at your office. But without additional oversight, these funds just can't be efficiently managed. And based on your testimony, I think I'm concerned about the culture at the EPA, which seems to be pretty resistant to transparency overall. I'll just ask you a general question, and in our limited time here, you've highlighted the unprecedented funding flowing through new programs created by the Inflation Reduction Act. Has the agency done enough to ensure that funds distributed through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund are managed responsibly? Are you funded to do that?
We are not funded to do that. The EPA has given us what they call gold standard meetings. We have met with them. I know that the agency is concerned about this. They have stated their concern, but they've also said that they're relying on us to make sure, they're relying on the OIG to make sure that these funds are expended appropriately, knowing that we aren't funded to do that.
What mechanisms do you have to actually look at subcontractees? I've seen a list of contractors, which are just groups of nonprofits that then get to spend the money how they see fit in many cases. Do you really have the ability to audit some of these subcontracts?
Yes, we can do that.
But you just said you're not funded to do that.
Well, so we can. We have the authorities to do it. Do we have the capacity to do it? No.
Okay. And how much money would that take? I mean, they put $100 billion into this, but they didn't put a dime into additional oversight for it. How much money would it take to?
I believe that, as we've said before, a fraction of a penny for every dollar that the EPA sends out would be sufficient for us.
Okay. Well, there was a lot of dollars sent out. It's a lot of pennies. I mean, do you have concerns about potential for taxpayer funding going to Chinese solar component manufacturers, even though it's explicitly said they should be American-made, but the reality is the supply chain is largely held up by China?
We have an abiding concern about the Buy America provisions across the board, including with respect to solar.
Because, why do you have a concern about that?
Well, in part, for me, it's always because there's a law that requires that these things be purchased from American sources. So, you know, there are, of course, concerns, national security concerns with respect to certain countries that manufacture it.
I understand, but what are your concerns
Oh, our
about
concern
the
is that
provision?
the EPA's guidance and oversight of these is quite poor. I mean, as I've said earlier, if you talk to stakeholders, they find the guidance so nebulous that they are deeply concerned that they are not complying with the BABA requirements, for example, that there's enough gray area in the guidance for people to come in and make money or to take over that industry where they themselves, and I'm speaking from the manufacturers, have been pretty fastidious in trying to meet the spirit of BABA. So that's an example of where we have a concern. Because ultimately, we're the ones who will have to bring these cases to the Department of Justice to prosecute.
Understood. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields. That concludes all the questions that we have right now from members. Mr. O'Donnell, thank you. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that will be the order. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witness to respond to the questions promptly. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.